During World War II, millions of people were caught in the middle of one of the deadliest wars in history. But there's one part of the story that most people don't talk about much. What the Nazis did to the female soldiers they captured. What happened to them was dark and horrifying. At the start of World War II in 1939, most armies across the world were made up almost entirely of men. War was seen as a man's job. Women were expected to stay at home, take care of families, or support the troops from behind the scenes. But as the war spread fast across Europe, Asia, and Africa, things began to change fast. Governments realized they needed more people. Men were dying on the front lines by the thousands, and countries couldn't keep up. That's when women stepped in. At first, they worked in factories making bombs, bullets, and airplanes. They drove trucks, repaired tanks, loaded ammunition, and ran communication lines. They worked as nurses, cooks, and radio operators. But that wasn't all. Some women wanted to fight, and many did. In the Soviet Union, more than 800,000 women served in the Red Army during the war. These women weren't just helping, they were on the front lines. Many became snipers, some of them incredibly skilled, with hundreds of confirmed kills. Others flew fighter planes in all-female air regiments, like the famous Night Witches, who carried out bombing missions in small, wooden planes. Some Soviet women also worked as medics under fire, carrying machine guns, laid mines, and even commanded tank crews. In Poland, thousands of women joined the underground resistance. They carried messages, hid weapons, treated wounded fighters, and even led sabotage missions against Nazi forces. During the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, Polish women fought alongside men in street battles, armed with homemade weapons and pure determination. In France, women were vital to the resistance movement. They helped organize escape routes, hid Allied pilots, and planted bombs. Some worked as couriers. Others spied on German troops and passed that information to the Allies. In Britain, women served in the Special Operations Executive, a secret group that trained agents to go behind enemy lines. British women were trained in weapons, radio signals, and survival, then parachuted into Nazi-occupied Europe to help local fighters. These were not ordinary roles. These women risked death every single day. Across other countries like Yugoslavia, Greece, and Italy, women joined partisan groups, fighting Nazi and fascist forces in mountains and cities. They blew up bridges, derailed trains, and snuck past checkpoints. But despite all this bravery, when Nazi forces captured these women, they didn't treat them like soldiers. The Nazis had a very strict and old-fashioned idea about what women should and shouldn't do. Their whole belief system, pushed by Adolf Hitler and his top leaders, was based on control, power, and racism, but also on specific gender roles. In their eyes, women had one main job: to be wives and mothers. They were supposed to stay at home, raise children, cook meals, and take care of the family. Hitler even gave awards to women who had lots of kids. There were medals for women who gave birth to 4 or more pure Aryan children. That's how serious they were about this idea. So when Nazi soldiers came across women who were armed, fighting, or organizing resistance, they didn't see them as soldiers. They saw them as a threat to everything they believed in. A woman with a gun was, to them, unnatural. It made them angry. Instead of treating captured female fighters with respect under the laws of war, the Nazis often reacted with violence. Many were tortured right away. Some were stripped, beaten, and starved. Others were raped or thrown into prison cells without food or water. Execution was common, sometimes after days of interrogation, sometimes right on the spot. The Nazi government also gave direct orders that made this cruelty seem official. One of the worst examples was something called the Commissar Order, issued on June 6, 1941, just before Operation Barbarossa, the massive Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. This order told German soldiers to shoot Soviet political officers immediately after capture. No trial, no questions, just kill them. But the Nazis didn't stop with commissars. They often applied the same rule to female soldiers and partisans, especially from the Soviet Union. If they caught a woman laying landmines, blowing up supply routes, or carrying messages for the Red Army, they'd treat her like a political threat, not a soldier. That meant no protection, no rights, and no mercy. In many Nazi reports, captured women weren't even called soldiers. They were labeled as bandits, terrorists, or criminals. This language gave the Nazis an excuse to ignore the Geneva Conventions. One of the most heartbreaking and famous stories from the war is the story of Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, an 18-year-old Soviet girl who became a symbol of resistance, and the terrible price many female fighters paid. Zoya was born in 1923 in a small village near Moscow. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, she didn't want to sit back and watch. Like many other young people, she wanted to fight. She joined a secret Soviet sabotage group called the Partisan Unit. These were small teams sent behind enemy lines to destroy German supply lines, or cut communications and burn resources that the Nazis could use. In November 1941, Zoya and her group were sent on a mission near the town of Petrovskoye, just west of Moscow. The goal was to burn barns and stables that the Germans were using for their horses and supplies. It was a freezing cold winter, but Zoya still went out alone at night with matches and a bottle of kerosene. She managed to set fire to one barn, but the next day she was captured by German soldiers. And that's where the nightmare began. The Nazis didn't care that she was just a teenager. They wanted names, information, anything she knew about other partisans. They beat her, stripped her, tortured her for hours, but she didn't talk. Witnesses later said she had bruises all over her body and her feet were so frostbitten she could barely walk. Still, she said nothing. The Germans decided to make an example of her. On November 29, 1941, they took Zoya to the center of the village and forced the local people to watch as they hanged her in public. She was barefoot, barely dressed, and in terrible pain. After the hanging, they left her body hanging for days in the snow. Later, they even cut off her body parts, including her breast, as a cruel message to others who might think about fighting back. When Soviet troops retook the area weeks later and learned what happened, Zoya's story spread quickly. The Soviet government turned her into a national hero. Her picture was printed in newspapers, and her story was told in schools. In February 1942, she became the first woman to be awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union during the war. The Nazis didn't always kill captured female soldiers right away. Many were taken to concentration camps where they faced months or years of torture, hunger, and hard labor before death. One of the most notorious camps for women was Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück was built in 1939 in northern Germany, not far from Berlin. It was the only major Nazi concentration camp built just for women. Over the course of the war, more than 130,000 women were imprisoned there. These weren't just Jewish women, they were political prisoners, members of resistance groups, nurses, doctors, and even captured female soldiers from countries like Poland, the Soviet Union, and France. The conditions inside Ravensbrück were beyond cruel. Women were forced to live in overcrowded wooden barracks, packed together in freezing temperatures, with no heating, barely any blankets, and lice everywhere. Food was scarce. Most women starved slowly, losing weight until they were just skin and bones. Diseases like typhus and tuberculosis spread quickly, and many died without medical help. The guards at Ravensbrück were brutal. They beat prisoners for the smallest reason. Some women were publicly whipped. Others were forced to stand outside in the cold for hours, or dragged to the punishment block for worse. However, one of the darkest parts of Ravensbrück was the medical experiments. The Nazis used the camp as a human laboratory. One group in particular became known as the Rabbits of Ravensbrück. there were 74 of them, most of them young women in their 20s from Poland. These women were chosen for what the Nazis called medical research, but in reality, it was pure torture, pretending to be science. Doctors like Dr. Karl Gebhardt, a top SS surgeon, carried out many of these experiments. The women's legs were cut open with scalpels, sometimes without proper anesthesia. Into these open wounds, the doctors would inject or pack in dangerous bacteria like Clostridium or Streptococcus. Then they would sew the wounds shut and wait, just to see what would happen. The goal, according to the Nazis, was to test new drugs and treatments for infections. But they weren't curing anyone. They were watching people suffer. The wounds would swell, fill with pus, and become horribly painful. Many of the women developed gangrene, blood poisoning, or massive abscesses. Some of them died within days from the infections. And that wasn't the end of it. In other cases, doctors removed muscles, tendons, or bones from the women's legs. Not because they were injured, but just to see how much damage the body could take. Some women were left with crippled legs, unable to ever walk again. A few had both legs damaged and could only move by crawling or being carried. They weren't just injured physically. The mental pain was just as bad. These women had already survived being captured, separated from their families, and thrown into a concentration camp. Now, they were being cut apart like animals, with no way to stop it. The Nazis called it research, but it wasn't medicine. It wasn't to help people. It was about control, cruelty, and punishment. One of the most horrifying parts of this story is the sexual violence that so many women suffered during the war. During the Nazi occupation of Europe, rape and sexual abuse were widespread. Captured female partisans and resistant members were especially at risk. In many cases, German soldiers raped these women during or right after capture. Sometimes it happened in secret. Other times it was done in front of other prisoners as a warning. It wasn't just individual acts either. In some places, the Nazis even set up brothels inside the camps, including at places like Ravensbrück and Auschwitz. These were called Lagerbordelle. They were run by the SS. Women prisoners were forced to have sex with German soldiers or camp guards. The Nazis claimed these brothels were to reward hard-working soldiers or to stop the spread of disease. But the women inside had no say. They were picked out of lines, taken to special buildings, and forced to live there, often for months, being raped again and again. The women who were sent to these places were often promised lighter work or better food. But once inside, they were trapped. Many of them ended up sick, emotionally broken, or even dead. If they became pregnant, they were usually forced to abort, sometimes through painful surgeries, sometimes through beatings or starvation. Babies born in camps were rarely allowed to live. One of the worst examples of Nazi violence happened after the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. The uprising lasted for 63 days. When it failed, the Nazis took revenge on the people of Warsaw, especially the women. Over 180,000 people were killed, and thousands of women were captured. Many of them were taken to makeshift prisons and raped repeatedly. Some were raped in front of their families. Others were dragged into buildings used by the SS. Pregnant women, old women, even teenage girls. No one was spared. If they survived the assaults, they were often sent to camps like Ravensbrück, where more suffering waited. It wasn't only Soviet or Polish women who suffered under the Nazis. Women from Britain and France, especially those working as secret agents, also faced terrible treatment if they were caught. These women were brave, smart, and highly trained. They worked behind enemy lines to help the resistance, and many of them paid with their lives. During the war, Britain's secret group SOE's job was to send spies to Nazi-occupied countries like France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The SOE believed that women could be especially useful in this role because they drew less suspicion than men. They could move freely through towns and villages, deliver messages, carry weapons, and help blow up railways or bridges. About 39 British women were sent into Europe by the SOE. Some were born in France or spoke French fluently. They were trained in things like parachuting, Morse code, self-defense, and sabotage. But once they landed in enemy territory, they were always in danger. If the Nazis caught them, they were usually tortured and killed. One of the most famous SOE agents was Violetta Szabo. She was born in France but raised in Britain, and she joined the SOE in her early 20s. Her job was to help organize resistance groups in France. She parachuted in during June 1944, just after D-Day. But not long after landing, she was captured by German troops in the Limoges region. Violette was taken for interrogation, where she was beaten and tortured. She refused to give up any information. After that, she was moved to several prisons, and then sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. There, she was put into forced labor, starved, and kept in freezing conditions. In February 1945, just a few months before the war ended, she was executed by a gunshot to the back of the head. She was only 23 years old. Another well-known SOE agent was Odette Sansom, who used the code name Lise. She was sent into France in 1942 and helped build up resistance networks. But in 1943, she was arrested by the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police. For months, she was held in Fresnes prison, where she was tortured repeatedly. They burned her back with hot irons, pulled out her toenails, and beat her, trying to get her to give up names. But Odette never broke. She kept silence to protect others. Later, she was sent to Ravensbrück too. Unlike Violette, she managed to survive the war. After the camp was liberated in 1945, she became a national hero in Britain and was awarded the George Cross for her bravery. There were many others. Nur Inayat Khan, a wireless operator who was captured and killed in Dachau in 1944. Denise Bloch, Liliane Rolf, Cecily Lafort, all women who risked their lives to fight the Nazis from behind enemy lines. Most of them were executed or died in camps. A few survived, but they were never the same again. In places like Ukraine and Belarus, women often joined local partisan groups to fight the Nazis. These women blew up trains, gathered information, and even ambushed German patrols. But when they were caught, they were punished harshly. In Belarus, the Nazis carried out large anti-partisan operations. During one operation in 1943, German forces wiped out entire villages, killing both fighters and civilians. Female partisans were usually tortured first. Many were hanged or burned alive in public. Others were sent to camps or shot in mass executions. It's hard to say exactly how many captured female soldiers the Nazis killed or abused. Many records were destroyed, and survivors didn't always talk about what they went through. But based on what historians know, the number is in the tens of thousands. At least 40,000 women were part of the Polish resistance. Thousands of them were captured and many died in camps. Over 800,000 Soviet women served in the military, and hundreds of them were taken prisoner. The Soviet government later reported that most of their female POWs were executed or tortured by the Germans. And then there were the women from France, Britain, and other countries, spies, saboteurs, couriers, who were captured and never seen again. After World War II ended in 1945, many survivors returned home. Their stories weren't always welcomed. Some countries saw captured female soldiers as shameful. Others didn't believe what had happened to them. In the Soviet Union, for example, women who had been POWs were often treated as traitors. Instead of being honored, they were sometimes sent to prison. Their suffering was hidden. Even in the West, many women never spoke about what they went through. Some were afraid no one would believe them. Others didn't want to relive the pain. As a result, it took decades before the full story started to come out. After the war, the Nazi leadership was put on trial in Nuremberg. Nuremberg in 1945-1946. Some SS doctors and camp leaders were also tried and executed, but not everyone who committed these crimes was punished. Many doctors from Ravensbrück were never caught. Some escaped to South America. A few even worked in other countries after the war. In recent years, researchers and historians have worked hard to uncover the names of the women who suffered. Survivors from Ravensbrück gave testimony. Books were written. Memorials were built. But justice was never complete. For many victims, there was no closure. This story is not just about history. It's about real women who paid a terrible price for standing up against evil, and they deserve to be remembered.